I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar on US foreign policy under President Biden, a new approach or third term Redux. My name is Zakaria Ahmad. I'm from Help University. I'm moderating this session. I have the assistance of Mr. Thomas Daniel from the Institute of Strategic International Studies. So this event is being co-organized by Help University together with the Institute of Strategic International Studies, Malaysia. So I want to say good morning to everybody who's in Malaysia and Singapore and in that time zone. And of course, a very good evening to those who are far away across the Pacific Ocean, especially our discussant, Ms. Elina Noor, who's based in Washington, D.C. Ladies and gentlemen, the format of this webinar is that we have about 1.5 hours to discuss the issues. We'll have a presentation by the speakers that we have organized for this webinar, and then a short, shall we say, discussion between the seminar discussants, and then we'll open it to the floor. I think this format is quite simple and easy to follow. I'd like to just introduce myself. My name is Zakaria Ahmad, as usual, and I would like to introduce the speakers. First of all, we have Professor Bill Borges from Help University. He's an expert on American affairs, and he hails from San Francisco. Is that right, Bill?
Yep, that sure is.
Yes. Then we have Ambassador Michalak, who is with the US-ASEAN Business Council. He's, of course, an American based in Singapore. He's a former ambassador of the United States Foreign Service. So we welcome you, sir, to this webinar. And then, of course, we have our dear friend, Ms. Elina Noor, who's no stranger to many of us. She is now a Deputy Director and Head of Political Security Affairs with the Asia Pacific Policy Institute, I believe, of the Asia Society. Welcome, Ms. Elina. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to now start the session. We'll have Bill to begin, and then followed by Ambassador Michalak, and then followed by Elina. So, Bill, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Zach, and thank you, Zach and Thomas, for inviting me. I can't think of anything that's greater honor than on the first day of the new administration to be able to be a part of something like this. And I also want to thank Ms. Elina and Ambassador Michael for participating with me. I'm just glad to be able to share these moments with you. What I want to emphasize to start with when it comes to predicting the behavior of any new president or the new administration generally, it always contains a huge amount of guesswork. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, what circumstances, situations, events will change. We were just made aware of this 2 weeks ago. We didn't know how the lead up to the inauguration of Joe Biden would go, and it was colored to an extent by the lawlessness at the Capitol with the break-in. But more than that, we've seen that in the past. I mean, I remember when George W. Bush was campaigning for president, one of his principal themes was that the U.S. is going to stay out of world affairs and events. We don't want to be a policeman. He went on and on about this, and all of that changed instantly and permanently with 9/11. And he's now best remembered, of course, for the Iraq and Afghanistan ventures, and thought of as a foreign policy president. So we're shaped to some extent by events. But notwithstanding all that, we can make, I think, some fairly good guesses about Biden because he's got such a lengthy history. and because he's not somebody who's given to wild swings of moods and changes in his ideological stances on things. I want to, first of all, then point out that he's got a break going in. And this is one that shouldn't be overlooked. And that is, he doesn't have to follow a John Kennedy or a Ronald Reagan or a Lincoln. He gets to follow Trump. And that's a break. You're going to have a very difficult time challenging Trump for the sort of low-level presence, behavior, lack of protocols, and so forth. Almost anything you do is going to stand out as good. So that's a break that Biden needs, and you need all the breaks you can get. I do think that many analysts have underestimated how important Biden's governmental experience is likely to be. When he came in to Congress, he was brand new, he was fresh, he didn't know much, but he served 44 years in government, 36 of those in the Senate. He understands the simple mechanics of things. Not only did Trump not understand those things, nor did he show an interest in trying to learn about them. But if you look to other people, Biden's experience also compares favorably with them too. Barack Obama had been a senator for 4 years, but hadn't been very integral of a player within the Senate. He really didn't understand the workings of government very well. Biden does. And who knows when that's going to come in handy for him, but I suspect that it will. As to how he's going to conduct himself and how the U.S. will conduct itself, therefore, when it comes to foreign policy, I think the first thing to note is that, as Biden said during the election campaign, his first priority is going to be trying to straighten out the two huge crises that are at home. Both they're related, of course. One is getting people vaccinated, figuring out how to get this program going so that it makes good sense, and in fact that it starts going as well as it has in so many other countries, particularly in Asia. And the other thing, of course, is trying to get the economy restarted. The economy, notwithstanding the remarks of Trump on his way out, the economy's not in good shape. It's very fragile, and we've got to figure out what to do to restart it. Now, one of those things that I'm expecting Biden to undertake, and I think Congress will follow on this, will be a huge infrastructure bill. I think that had Donald Trump started with that rather than his failed attempt to overturn the health care plan of Obama's, I think had he done that, he might have been on a different path during his presidency, but he didn't. He promised it, he never delivered, and I think there'll be a huge infrastructure bill, which is badly needed in the U.S. Eventually, of course, he's going to have to make clear his reach to the rest of the world, to other countries. And I think that all the signs suggest that he's going to be a multilateralist when it comes to trade policy, when it comes to combating global warming. He's already gotten us back in the Paris Accords. When it comes to almost everything that involves our adversaries as well as our allies, there are signs that Biden wants things to get back to what used to be sort of a status quo, an international relations status quo. How successful he'll be at that, we don't know. But he's got one big advantage going for him. People want him to win. They want to get back to normal, and they want to, in the U.S. and among our allies, they want things. They're saying, well, maybe the status quo wasn't perfect, but it was a lot better than what we've had the last 4 years. And so I think he wants to do that. The one big exception to this, perhaps, in terms of altering, changing, moving away from Trump's policies will be with China. I think that most Democrats feel that the single large area of policy where Trump was right, broadly right, even though it was done in a clumsy fashion perhaps, was with China. I think Americans felt that China had been cheating, had been taking U.S. technology unfairly, and I do think that there'll be the imposition of a continuation of the tariffs, and then probably a number of harsh measures that'll be taken if things don't begin to improve fairly quickly. But that's the only area of foreign relations where I can see a lot of overlap with him. I don't know what he'll do on some of the other things that are important to people, with the Middle East, for example. I doubt that he's going to try to move the embassy in Israel back to Tel Aviv. I don't think he'd do that. But who knows? It wouldn't have happened had he been a president, and it was something that was more than just symbolic. It was an important move. I do think that in terms of Southeast Asia and the things that are important to us and Asia broadly, I do think he's going to make a huge effort to get the U.S. Into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You'll recall this was something that Obama worked very hard on. It was actually one of Obama's most strenuous efforts, I would say, when he was president, to get us in. And this is something that really the U.S. could have benefited from, could have profited from, just like the 7 Asian partners that are in it, including Malaysia. And we got yanked out of it at the last second by Trump. As soon as he came into office, he pulled us out. And many people say, well, a lot of Democrats really aren't that high on these kind of measures. And that's true. And it will take support in the Senate to get the U.S. into TPP. But one thing that I think is important to note is that many Democrats might just want to get us into TPP simply because it'll be a rebuke to Trump. And I know that might sound like the kind of pettiness that we've been used to for 4 years, but politics can be a funny thing. I think it'd be clearly in the U.S. interest to get into TPP, and I think that Biden has already suggested that even though he won't move on it immediately, that he will eventually. As far as Biden's cabinet is concerned, people have pointed out that many of these are old timers, people from the Obama and even the Clinton administrations, and this is to be expected. He's certainly going to pick people who have the sorts of ideas, the sorts of ideological preferences that most Democrats have, and he wanted seasoned people. That's why he picked Ron Klain as chief of staff. It's the reason he picked. He made excellent choices, in my view, when it came to state defense, and even the Attorney General. Though picking Merrick Garland was probably a matter of justice, because Garland had been sort of cheated out of even a chance at getting to sit on the Supreme Court. And so I'm optimistic when I look at his cabinet. These don't look like people who are just hardened ideologues who want to go off on any crazy ventures. I think they're people who understand how the world works and the kind of changes that we're looking for in the future, ones we need. And then finally, everybody needs to remember this, and I'm not the first one to say it, and I'm probably not going to say it the best, but nothing's going to change overnight. Problems aren't going to disappear. Circumstances aren't going to suddenly favor everything that we want to do. But there is hope now. There's a huge sense of hope, I think, that has enveloped America and much of the world, because regardless of people who tend to be sort of cynical about things, people around the world do look to America. I think it is the largest economy in the world and obviously a huge military power. People look to it. But more than that, it's a beacon. It is a beacon of democracy, and it's had a whole bunch of failures, a whole bunch of flaws. It has had them. It'll continue to have them. But most of us, most Americans, want to see the U.S. back in a position where it is friendly with its allies and cordial and respectful of its adversaries. And that's sort of the thing. I'm not trying to be Pollyanna, but that's sort of the kind of approach I expect with the Biden administration.
Thank you very much, Bill. I think that was a very useful opener. I think those of us who watched the inauguration, I think felt very inspired by the speech that he gave. It was more than hope. I think there was a commitment to make America better and to restore what he called the decency in terms of the American role in global politics. He's hit the ground running. He's already sworn in 1,000 staffers who are going to be in the new administration. You're right. Some of them are old hands. Biden himself, is an old hand. He's an insider within the Beltway, and he brings not just that experience, but I believe he is going to, adopt much more a bipartisan approach in American politics, in American policy. And I think the fact that the Democrats are now in control of Congress, there will be a great deal of, shall we say, help to Mr. Biden as he brings the legislative branch back in unison with the presidency. And you're right about the fact that he will have to deal with the, shall we say, outstanding problems in America today. And number one, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's significant, I think, that the president and the vice president and the spouses were at the Washington Monument, and they saw this, shall we say, this more not monument, but the lights that had been lighted up for the 400,000 deaths because of the COVID-19. So this is the major problem the United States would do, and we all look very positively to that. And of course, the other issues that we already raised. And now I'd like to turn to Ambassador Michalak. Sir, if you may.
Oh, sure thing. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come here. This is a great idea, and it's a very timely idea. You can't get much more timely than this unless we'd done it last night. So it was really a good idea, and I'm very pleased to be here. I'm afraid you're going to be hearing a lot of the same things that Bill just said, but I think they bear repeating, and we're all going to say it in different ways anyway. So one of the things that I wanted to start with was to take a look at the circumstances under which the Obama-Biden administration took office and began governing compared to that when Joe Biden was reelected more than 2 months ago. There are some huge differences, I think, that are important to understanding the shifts in the domestic and global situation facing the United States and the changes in attitudes and aspirations of the American people. The last time Joe Biden participated in a transition was also a time of economic disruption and stimulus measures. And we all remember the Lehman shock, the US stock market losing more than 50% of its values, global recession, and millions of consumers afraid of losing their homes. Well, at that time, the newly elected Obama-Biden ticket stepped in and passed about $500 billion worth of stimulus programs. And now, here we are, with the Biden administration entering office at another time of disruption. Only this time, we've already spent $2 trillion. And just before the inauguration, Congress passed another stimulus of close to $1 trillion. And the incoming Biden administration is preparing to spend another $2 trillion. And we're still not sure it will be enough to save those who are in trouble. Moreover, one of the huge tragic differences between now and then is that we also have close to 500,000 Americans dead from a virus. Efforts to fight the virus were totally mishandled through the incompetence, neglect, and ignorance of the previous government's top leaders, leaving millions of Americans bewildered, shocked, without confidence in their own government and institutions, and having just gone through an attempted coup and fearing the possibility of more violence. So returning to a government headed by someone that represents a return to a more normal, reasonable style of governing is being welcomed around the world. So in one sense, whether or not we're returning to a third term of the Obama administration is immaterial. Returning to some semblance of normalcy is a truly welcome step compared to the chaos in the past 4 years. And you can feel the deep breath that all Americans took last night and the deep breath that people around the world are taking as they wake up to a new day. But as you all know, the world is a dynamic system, and especially in these uncertain times, attitudes change, people's views change, and circumstances shift roles and missions which we all play. And these shifts, of course, play a role in which the new administration is going to deal with issues. You know, if you think back on the Obama-Biden years, we see that the US relationship with Southeast Asia, and more specifically with ASEAN, was looked upon as one of the most ASEAN-friendly periods of the US-ASEAN relationship. At that time, I had been appointed as US ambassador to Vietnam under the Bush administration and continued on through the Obama administration. So I had a front row seat to witness many of the signature events of the time, like our accession to the ASEAN Treaty of Amity and Friendship, the creation of new ASEAN institutions like the Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, when it was formed in Hanoi in 2010 during the Vietnam chairmanship of ASEAN. And also to be involved in discussions with ASEAN officials as well as within the US government concerning China and its intentions in the South China Sea, which in many ways marked the beginning of the new style of Chinese foreign policy. I believe that the Obama administration had excellent relations with most ASEAN nations, though, as always, there were complaints that the US was not doing enough, especially on the economic side. On the other hand, there were welcoming statements for the pivot towards Asia, and the TPP, as Bill so rightly pointed out, was also welcomed as a very positive move, and particularly the fact that it has 4 ASEAN members. Unfortunately, the TPP was not allowed to be carried out to its hoped-for conclusion. But even with these ups and downs during the Obama-Biden administration, there was opportunities for the ASEAN member states to air their views on all of these issues, because the president himself came to all the ASEAN meetings, except for one when the US government was going through a shutdown. But he showed up, and that administration was there. And Joe Biden was a key player in that relationship. In many ways, he was Obama's closest advisor. It was always said that he was the last one to be in a room and have his say with Obama concerning any major decision. And Biden's 30+ years in the Senate gave him the governance and political credentials to be an articulate and passionate member of the Obama team. So there were many good features about the Biden-Obama partnership, and I'm confident that Biden and his cabinet will, at a minimum, want to carry on the strong relationship, the strategic partnerships, which were started the last time Joe Biden was in government. The pandemic, of course, is the all-encompassing issue that the US has also suffered from a great deal because of mismanagement and incompetent leadership. And it will take an enormous effort to get the virus under control, and that is going to be job one and will consume a great deal of time and attention. The divisions within the American body politic also run deep, and you heard during the inaugural speech that unity was a huge theme and a huge issue with which Biden and his staff are going to deal. And I think it's significant that Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, actually wanted to deal with domestic policy because he thought that that would be the most pressing and complicated issue facing the new administration from day one. And speaking of pandemics and speaking of health, Joe Biden has been a guy who's always had an abiding interest in healthcare policy, and you can be sure that no matter how your domestic policy goes, these are going to be issues that he's going to deal with firsthand. And so it's clear that from the facts on the ground and Biden's own words, the domestic situation must be at top of mind for the new administration. But having said that, the world is not going to let him concentrate totally on domestic affairs. Perhaps the biggest foreign policy issue facing the new government will be repairing and reviving our relationships with our allies and partners. Our foreign policy apparatus is severely damaged. Can you believe that we have not had an ambassador at ASEAN or in Singapore for 4 years? Joe Biden is used to working in a collegial atmosphere from his time in the Senate and in the White House. And he and his cabinet understand from their long years of experience that no one nation can resolve the issues facing the world today. We need to be part of the like-minded groups in facing the many issues like climate change, nuclear proliferation, and the like. And this is especially true in the Asian century, where countries in the region are playing a more active role in what happens here and what happens around the world. You know, Kurt Campbell, who many of you have probably know and have worked with when he was in government in the past, will be the NSC coordinator for Asia. This is a clear indication that the US is ready to get back in the game and ready to work hard on making that a reality. You cannot have a more experienced or savvy person in that job, and I expect him to be out here often, as he was when he worked for Secretary Clinton. Clearly, China will be a huge part of Biden's foreign policy. And we can get into the details in the ensuing discussion, but let me use China also as a case in point that illustrates how the world has changed since this crowd was in power last time. Now, this is a place where many of our old ideas have changed and is going to be reflected in policy. Where in the past, the polls showed that most Americans wanted to make allowances for China in the hopes that it would become a responsible stakeholder in global governance. Well, those same polls now show that most Americans view China as a strategic competitor with whom we need to be much more careful and much more vocal in registering opposition to certain policies while working with our friends and allies and partners to craft areas where it might make sense to work with China. New technologies and new relationships formed over the past 4 years are going to mean different discussions and different attitudes within the US. Over the past 4 years, long-standing coalitions became weaker or broke down, and coordination became rusty and disused. The US was out of the game for 4 years, and countries learned to move ahead without us. We need to earn our place back at the table, and that's going to take some adjustment on both sides. Another adjustment is going to be in trade. And there also, we've been out of the game for 4 years, and trade has been handled as a zero-sum game. But America first has meant America alone, and the new administration does not believe in this worldview. The list of issues facing us on trade is long and unfortunately urgent. We will need rather quickly to look at the possibility of trade promotion authority. If we're to renew that legislation, it needs to start around now to be debated and worked through the Congress this year. Without it, trade negotiations are going to be difficult or impossible because Congress would be able to raise all kinds of objections to negotiated texts, which would destroy the credibility of USTR and the executive branch to engage in trade deals. And we have 3 or 4 potential trade deals with Europe, Africa, and Asia, which are ready for negotiation now. And within Asia, the CPTPP and RCEP are 2 agreements covering a majority of global trade, and the US is not a member of either. Given the pace of change of technology and its effect on global supply chains and trade patterns, we need to be at the table to ensure that the interests of all firms are considered in setting rules and standards for the next generation of commerce. Moreover, if we're serious about wanting to reform the rules of trade and commerce, we need to deal with WTO reform in a credible way, and especially to deal with the impasse over who will be the next Secretary General of the WTO. So I believe there's also been a shift in attitude within the US on trade. I'm not going to say that we're jumping at the chance to rejoin the TPP, or rather the CPTPP. And I must say that I'm not sure that I would agree 100% with Bill in that Biden's going to try to rejoin it. I think he's going to try to rejoin son or daughter of CPTPP. One of the things I am saying is that the conversation is no longer about why trade is bad for workers in America, but the new conversation is how can we make trade agreements that are working for the middle class? The USMCA agreement, the US, Mexico, Canada, and US, the old NAFTA 2.0, passed the Congress and was welcomed by broad swaths of the American people, including major labor unions. It was treated and hailed as a positive achievement. This is the first trade agreement in decades to have such overwhelming bipartisan support, and much of the new language in the USMCA was taken from the TPP, especially the digital parts. The person who shepherded that agreement through the Congress was Katherine Tai. She is Biden's choice for US Trade Representative, and that appointment has been widely acclaimed by both Republicans and Democrats. So you're going to see more action on trade, probably sooner than the Biden administration wishes for, but for which I believe they'll be more than ready. The United States has also always been proud of its values, and it stood up in defense of our values around the globe. This reputation has also been neglected and damaged in recent years, and we will have to rebuild that brand. I believe the Biden administration will be pragmatic in dealing with human rights and will try to be sensitive in how it handles those discussions. But again, America in recent polls have shown that Americans do believe in dealing with these issues, and this administration will do so. We know that we have our own human rights issues, which we acknowledge and with which we must deal. But we will also have to speak out when we feel it's necessary, like in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang. Here is another place where the Obama administration example was instructive by being attentive, but not preachy. So in sum, I believe that the Biden administration has connections to the Obama team and has carried forward some of the good lessons from those times. But this administration's roots in American history, values, and hopes and dreams run much deeper. The new administration has been listening to the people, observing the disaster of the last 4 years, and has made significant adjustments to meet the changing times. So now the curtain has gone up on a new chance to make a difference. And I look forward to doing what I can to help make the future a bright and inclusive one in connection with people in the rest of the world, and particularly my friends and partners out here in Asia. So thanks very much for the chance to be here, and I look forward to the continuing discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think there was a very big plate of issues and challenges that you have outlined for all of us. I think what's important for us here in this particular webinar is that you brought to into focus the issue of Southeast Asia and ASEAN, and what the United States is going to do, and of course to deal with that very, very outstanding issue of China. And of course here is about not just China-US relations, but of course in terms of whether or not there is a changing balance of power that's taking place, and how the United States is going to deal with this particular challenge during the Biden administration. You also indicated or highlighted the issue about the divisions that have existed in American society, or at least that emerged, and the need for healing on the part of the Biden administration. And of course, one of the problems that the United States has is, as it's placed its global role, there is the issue of what we call the trust deficit. There seems to taken place, I think a lot of people around the world, especially, I just saw a survey report from Europe, which indicated that the Europeans seem to think that, you know, they can't rely on the United States as they used to. I think this is an issue that they'll have to deal with. And of course, this outstanding matter of trade. And here, of course, we go back to the issues of the CPTPP and that sort of free trade agreements and what the United States will do. So I think one last point I just want to say from listening to you is that it probably is not a good point to say that the people who have been working for the Biden administration are people who used to work for the Obama administration. I think there's a fresh look that I see emerging among the people who are coming into the US government. And now I'd like to turn to Elina. Of course, Elina works for the Asia Society, and as you know, the Asia Society have been very diligent. They've issued actually a list of recommendations to the new Biden administration, which I think Elina may want to highlight some of them. But over to you, Elina.
Thank you so much, Prof. Zach. Thank you in particular for plugging that piece of work that we just issued and launched not too long ago at the beginning of this year. I'm happy to go into any of the recommendations if there is interest. One of the perils or pluses of coming in last in line on a panel is that you realize just before you're about to speak that you're actually in the company of great minds. So I could end it right here because I agree with a number of points that have already been raised. But let me nonetheless try to offer some perspectives. My short answer to the question of today's discussion is yes, we can expect a fresh approach to a US foreign policy relative to that of the last 4 years. And no, it will not be an Obama third term, or not completely anyway. Let me expand by offering 3 points for consideration. One, by contrast to the stormy and rather graceless conduct of US foreign policy at the highest levels over the last several years, the Biden administration promises a return to a more temperate style of diplomacy, one led by seasoned officials who recognize the urgency of the pandemic and climate change, who are welcoming of multilateralism and cooperation, and perhaps most importantly, who have spoken plainly about the importance of humility in earning back respect for American leadership in the world. And I want to emphasize earning back, not assuming that respect will be given just because America has said that it will be back. Biden's inauguration speech, which many of you may have already caught live, spoke of there being much to repair, to restore, to heal, to build in America. His speech, along with the words of others on his team, such as Jake Sullivan, as Ambassador Michalak mentioned, the NSA designate, and Tony Blinken, Secretary of State nominee, have shown that this is an America that recognizes that it is wounded, but that it will be willing to listen and learn in order to lead, rather than to lash out in fear and anger. Now, hopefully this will indeed be the case over the next few years. The tendency for a superpower to act superlatively can be irresistibly powerful, as we've seen time and time again with US actions, not just in Asia, but elsewhere as well. For now, what we have is a promise of an America that will, quote, repair its alliances, leading not by the example of power, but by the power of its example, as Biden has famously said, which is a marked contrast to Trump's America First inauguration speech that accused other countries of ripping off America's wealth, strength, and confidence. Two, it is true that there are many returning Obama-era political appointees to senior positions in the Biden administration. So on the one hand, their experience offers a sense of comfort and reassurance. Kurt Campbell's been talked about, his return to government in the newly created role of Indo-Pacific Coordinator at the NSC, for example, will provide relief to those who wondered whether Asia will be back on the US's radar. On the other hand, there are also reservations about the risks of groupthink and repeating mistakes of the past. But America is different than it was during the Obama years, Prof. Zak, as you yourself mentioned. America is now of the bipartisan opinion that China is the most significant challenge to the US. In what way, it's not made clear. The subtext is that it is the most significant challenge to US leadership. And in the words of the Secretary of Defense nominee, General Lloyd Austin, China is, quote, a pacing threat. Again, threat to what? We still await clarification. America's tough stance against China over the last 4 years will prevail. The only difference is that this time, the US will seek to coordinate efforts with, quote, like-minded countries to confront China, even as it leaves some room for cooperation with China where possible. For example, on climate change, which now has its own special presidential envoy in John Kerry. Because of bipartisan consensus on getting tough with China, many of Biden's Asia hands are also now, whether tangentially or in the main, China hands. For us in Southeast Asia, this brings the risk of the US's Southeast Asia policy being once again subsumed under its China policy, maybe just less overtly. But it is not just America that has changed its foreign policy. And this is my third and final point. The world has also changed. In a way, it's moved on from looking to the US as a global leader after seeing that leadership implode with America's withdrawal from the rules-based system that it ironically has chosen to underscore at every opportunity it can. In trade in particular, Asia has shown that it can move forward without the US with the completion of the CPTPP and RCEP. And even if the US shows interest in joining CPTPP, there seems no indication so far that this will be happening anytime immediately. The US will have to join on the terms of the current signatories, which, while welcoming of US interest in market access and all that, will still be unwilling to unpick all that has been negotiated. COVID will no doubt challenge the region's, the world's economic recovery. But as America focuses on fixing its own domestic issues, especially for most of Biden's first year in office, Asia will no doubt be doing the same. And in doing so, Asia will continue to grow the agency it's beginning to discover and the cooperative bonds it's forged among itself in public health, trade, and other issues in the absence of American leadership over the last few years. The expectation is that hopefully America will re-engage, and this would of course be welcomed, particularly if the manner of that re-engagement is respectful, as has been said, rather than alienating. We've not yet heard very much about a specific Southeast Asia policy, which is somewhat comforting and disturbing at the same time, beyond a promise that America will show up to ASEAN summit meetings. So that's encouraging. We should expect democracy and human rights to figure again in US foreign policy, which may or may not be received well in this region for a number of reasons that we can get to in discussion. And maybe Southeast Asia will also finally get a US ambassador to ASEAN after 4 years, as Ambassador Michalak pointed out. But for now, the region, I believe, will carry on as it has always done, and working level relations will continue as they always have. There may, after all, be another dramatic change or even paralysis in the US's system in the next few years that Asia will once again have to adapt to, whether it's the congressional midterm elections or the next presidential election. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to a robust conversation with those who are in attendance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elina. You mentioned that the world has changed. I think it's very clear that all three speakers, including you, have also indicated that the United States has changed. And I think this is the shall we say, the format we need to look at, because what Biden brings, is he bringing promise, or is he going to come out of this not be able to fulfill some of the, shall we say, the desiderata that the United States would like to do. I feel that Mr. Biden, because he's 78, You know, one of the things that was remarked to me when he was giving his inauguration speech was that he was like a father talking to the nation. And I think this is quite a useful point to remember, because I think Biden not only brings the experience, but I think he also brings wisdom to US policy. You single out the issue about Sino-US relations, and of course what the impact that means for what the consequences of that are for Southeast Asia. I think most of the Southeast Asian countries have been caught in this difficulty of having to deal with this rivalry that takes place between the two big powers, and of course what the impact, of course, in terms of the South China Sea. I think this is an area that probably we hope to see some kind of advance in terms of how the Southeast Asian countries and the United States will deal with this particular issue. And of course, as Ambassador Michalak has pointed out, you know, there's need to deal with the economic kind of issues and the trade that needs to take place in this part of the world. So I'd like to open now the discussion to the panelists. If they have questions or their comments they'd like to on each other's presentations, and maybe highlight some of the main outstanding issues that we need to think about as we discuss this issue of the new Biden administration. So I'd like to begin, whether Bill, you'd like to start first, and then we'll just circulate around among the panelists.
Sure. I appreciate the meaningful and very pertinent comments that were made by the ambassador and Elina. One of the things that I think that people really don't understand that was kind of woven into the comments by all three of us is how little the U.S. has really engaged in trade agreements, not just during the Trump years, but otherwise. We've got only about 10% of the countries in the world, fewer than that actually, who are actually in trade agreements with us. Now, trade agreements don't always produce free trade, but they at least provide a framework for going ahead with trade. And the U.S. really has pitifully few when you compare it to other countries, including other Western countries. We have so little. So I guess my point is on that, and I'd like to hear the beliefs, the ideas of the others as well, is that there is just huge opportunity here to enter into something new, and it's something that's been largely ignored. We just sort of assume that since the U.S. is such a big economy and we buy so much from overseas and we sell so much that things are fine, they've gone. But really, we need more trade agreements, in my view.
Okay. So, Elina or Michael, if you have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to get onto that one. One thing I wanted just to verify, Elina, the recommendations that you were talking about, does that include Wendy Cutler's remarks on trade agreements that she's brought out for the Biden administration?
Wendy's report on a sectoral approach to trade agreements is a separate report, but there are trade recommendations in our set of recommendations as well. Right.
Well, Wendy and I have worked together for many, many years. And I was also the U.S. ambassador for APEC. And during our time there in 2006, which was actually, again, it was the Vietnam year, we actually got put into the leaders' statement the beginning of the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. That was the first time that the leaders had actually all agreed, and I personally was up until 2 in the morning talking with the Chinese delegation to make sure that we had a consensus working on this thing. But this is to your point, Bill. I think that we do see a need for trade. We do see a need for trade agreements, but we also see a need for trying to do it in a way that establishes some rules and is pretty inclusive. right now, there are so many differences in economic development around the world, around the region, that it's very hard to get a big, massive trade agreement going. The Doha round took, I don't know how many years and ultimately collapsed. So I think that there's definitely appetites within the United States to do this. There has been for a long time, as you pointed out, there has been this fear on the part of many usually in the labor union side, that it was taking away jobs. But I think that viewpoint is gradually changing from, as I mentioned in my remarks, from a way of labor looking at trade agreements as destructive of jobs to reversing that mode of argumentation to say, how do we start out by making a trade agreement that creates jobs? How do we start out by trying to make a trade agreement that guarantees jobs or guarantees better circumstances for workers, not only in the countries that are joining these trade agreements? And I think that you are going to see more interest in trade agreements. The ones that, the sectoral agreements that I was mentioning before, the ones that Wendy was talking about from the Asia Policy Institute, are talking about digital economy and how do we get the digital economy, or how do we help spread the benefits of the digital economy, and at the same time ensure that it does not, that it creates jobs for everybody around the world. And I think you're going to see more of that happening as we go forward. I know that everybody has recommended to the Biden administration that we look at this very seriously. The USMCA, as we just mentioned, already has some digital provisions in it. The agreement that we were working on with Japan has got digital provisions in it. And there are many multilateral agreements here. So I think you're going to find a lot of it going forward.
Can I get a response from any of you about the question about the US-China relationship? I mean, this is a major issue. It's got to do with Taiwan. It's got to do with this trade war that Mr. Trump embarked on, and of course the South China Sea. And what likely is going to be the Biden administration's response or approach on all of these issues. I think Mr. Blinken, I think the new Secretary of State, I think he basically said that the United States will continue to be tough on, first of all, the Uyghur problem, and of course I think there's a commitment in the United States and that they will stand by Taiwan, and of course in the South China Sea, whether or not the US will continue to predominate in terms of its military presence. So if any of you would like to respond to that. Maybe Elina?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. Thank you, Prof. I think the Biden administration will be challenged by a number of landmines that outgoing Secretary of State Mike Pompeo very generously threw in the way of the Biden administration on its way out. So the lifting of self-imposed restrictions in the US's diplomatic conduct with Taiwan, for example, will complicate not just US-China relations, but US-Taiwan relations as well. And I think that Blinken's and Jake Sullivan's articulation of being tough on China, although that's a continuation of the Trump policy, I think there is some room for cooperation on, particularly as I mentioned, climate change. There has been some talk that there may be some willingness to return to some sort of negotiations on cybersecurity, particularly in the wake of what's been going on the trade section with Trump's sanctioning of numerous Chinese companies. But I'm not sure that there is sufficient appetite on both political sides to repeat what the Obama administration did with China in trying to come to an agreement that there won't be a continuation of intellectual property theft. So all this to say, I think that as if the US-China relationship were not complicated enough, the Trump administration on its way out has decided to throw a few more bombs just to make things a little more difficult. And this in turn will make things difficult in Southeast Asia because the region will feel more and more squeezed, particularly as we in the region pitch our future on the fourth industrial revolution, the digital economy, and all sorts of tech acronyms that go with it. But we'll find ourselves squeezed in terms of supply chain security, the cybersecurity of networks, platforms, and systems, vendors. And so I think we'll have to think through very carefully as we try to engage not just China on BRI projects, but also with our European, Japanese, and American partners going forward.
Michael, you want to come in on this one?
Sure. We actually, as the Senior Vice President at the US-ASEAN Business Council, this is very much top of mind for us. A lot of our members are companies like Qualcomm and Intel and other high-tech companies that actually do have relationships with China. And so it's very much at top of mind how to go forward on this relationship. And it is true that there will not be any lifting of sanctions or tariffs anytime soon. I think that there are probably two things that are going to have to be done before any of that is seriously contemplated. One of them is going to be a discussion amongst our partners and allies. The idea that the United States alone can work on these issues is wrong, and wrong-headed as well as being wrong on the facts. I think that what we need to do is to work with like-minded people to figure out exactly where we can and cannot have cooperation. There are some places where there has been, whether it's cyber espionage or good old-fashioned spying or whatever you want to say, there are those kinds of issues which need to be discussed within our group and countermeasures decided upon. But there are also measures where there can possibly be cooperation, which I think also need to be discussed. So first talking among allies, then actually setting up some kind of a discussion between the US and China. And I would bet within the year, you will see that there is going to be a new dialogue between the US and China, which will not be called a strategic dialogue, not be called strategic and economic dialogue. It will have to have a new name befitting a new administration, but it's very likely to have cabinet level or sub-cabinet level officials to try to get together and re-engage on issues like state-owned enterprise subsidies, like intellectual property, like cybersecurity, and many of these tough issues. You can't just let people go off on their own and without at least trying to sit down and talk about these in a situation that is not characterized by, as Elina pointed out, throwing bombs and yelling and screaming at each other. I mean, you can yell and scream at each other in private, but let's not do it in public. So yeah, I think that it's extremely important, and I believe that this administration understands the importance of the security aspects, which we have not understood well enough in the past, but we also understand the potential for cooperation and reasonableness in terms of going forward to try to, as much as possible, be as cooperative as possible.
Thank you, Michael. Elina, I just want you to give us a little snapshot of the recommendations that were issued by the Asia Society, and especially highlight those issues we have not really touched on, especially as those that deal with Asia. Would you like to do that? Just a few minutes.
Thank you. It's very kind of you, Prof. Zach. As I was listening to Ambassador Michalak, it occurred to me that one of the recommendations that we put forward to the Biden team, which we actually got some good comments on, is a high-level US-China dialogue, not along the lines of the strategic and economic dialogue, but something a little more back channel. And our specific recommendation is that both Presidents Biden and Xi could designate a trusted principal to develop this direct and authoritative line of communication, such as the one that Lighthizer and Liu He had. And once this trust is built between both sides, this channel could be used to clarify red lines. So that's just one of the courses of action that we've suggested with regards to US-China relations. We've also suggested cooperation with China to avoid a global sovereign debt crisis, to work on climate change, not just between both sides, but also including the EU countries as well as South Korea and Japan. And finally, closer to home, Southeast Asia, we of course, made the low-hanging recommendation fruit of just showing up, because that's a low bar that hopefully the US can actually cross. Show up at ASEAN summit meetings, appoint an ambassador to ASEAN, and with Indonesia becoming more and more important and more of a strategic partner to the US, we've somewhat jokingly, but only half jokingly suggested that the US send former President Obama out to Indonesia for a one-week-long goodwill tour to try to repair relations and try to signal renewed US commitment to Indonesia as the largest country in Southeast Asia, but also to Southeast Asia more broadly.
Thank you very much, Elina. And now we're going to open the discussion to the floor, to the rest of the audience. I just want to say, as we begin this discussion, that one of the inspirational comments that was made by Mr. Biden was that in his speech, was that he said that it is not about the United States trying to show the example of its power, but to show the power example. I think this is a very positive approach that the new Biden administration is going to take as a global actor. And I think that augurs well for the US role in the world. And now I'd like to open for discussion. Mr. Thomas Daniel, my co-moderator, is here to list out the questions for all of us. We'll probably open it up for 3 questions to begin with. Yeah, and once he's got all the questions, maybe we need to show it to the panelists, right? Oh, yeah, okay.
Thank you very much, Prof. Zach. Ladies and gentlemen, we have quite a few questions to go through, but we only have about 20 minutes because I plan to turn this over to Prof. Zach 5 minutes before we are due to end. So quite a number of the questions have already been touched on by the panelists, especially on China and on trade in different angles. So I am going to ignore some of the most obvious. I'm forced to sort of skip through some of the most obvious ones. But however, and I will group some of the questions in series to present them to all the speakers to answer. And I do apologize if I'm not able to highlight the names of the individuals who asked, the participants who asked the questions, because some of these are grouped. Now, in conversations on China and Southeast Asia, one thing that I think the panelists have not really addressed has been the issue of the South China Sea, and that has come up in some of the comments and the Q&As. So I was wondering if any of the panelists would be willing to speak about how this Biden administration could approach the South China Sea dispute. As many of you are aware, there is a real concern in Southeast Asia and among the claimant countries that this dispute is increasingly being subsumed within the wider US-China rivalry. That's one question. And the second question that I would like to highlight comes from Professor Dr. Sharifah Munira Alatas. And she, in particular, was wondering if a Biden administration could conceive a more inclusive UN Security Council in its interactions with the UN. Will there be room for further discussion and considerations? to expand permanent membership, but mostly to include voices of the global South from Africa, Latin America, and post-colonial nations. Let us start with these two first. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Any of you want to start off by answering or dealing with those issues? South China Sea and a more inclusive Security Council, right?
Well, in trying to respond to the first one, this is something that it's not surprising that probably the three of us didn't address this specifically. It's very perplexing. China has shown no interest or worry about anyone, any country, any speakers who have ever questioned their exploitation in Southeast Asia. The South China Sea, they seem to believe, is their own province and they can do as they wish. This doesn't necessarily mean that they couldn't be moved. I think they probably could. But what this points to, in my view, is the need for an overarching approach to China. One that is going to take many of these things, as Elina sort of pointed out, into account. Now, for example, with Taiwan, it's much more complicated than simply doing what Trump did just before he left office to irritate China. The United States has a long-standing agreement to protect Taiwan, and China knows this. In the event they're threatened, that they are attacked. So all of these things, including their adventures in the South China Sea, all of this has to be taken into account. And broadly speaking, the way to do this, it seems to me, would be to come up with, as the ambassador pointed out, some common ground. This is the way agreements always get reached, whether it's with individuals or with companies or with countries. Historically, this is the way it works. You have to come up with something in common. Sometimes that simply means finding a common enemy. This was something during the Cold War that the US tried to utilize, because you had China and the Soviet Union as enemies, both of which hated each other more than they did the United States. And that sort of thing sometimes has to be relied upon. But nevertheless, you need some common ground, and these things aren't going to be solved independently, it seems to me.
Michael, the US-ASEAN Business Council, they are a business group, right? I mean, I think US-ASEAN Business Council, with all its members, I think they have quite a lot of views about the South China Sea, I think.
Well, certainly the Malacca Straits, absolutely. I mean, with the 80% of the world's energy going through there and other astronomical percentage of world trade going through there, yes, it's very important that freedom of navigation and openness of sea lanes be maintained. And that is something which I believe that everyone around the world believes, and is certainly going to be one of the bases for the way in which the United States looks at the South China Sea. It's a very difficult issue because of the way in which, as Professor Bill has pointed out, China has pretty much ignored the United Nations, the law of the sea, and all international discourse on that issue. It's something that is going to be a very tough topic to work on with China. I happened to be at the meeting of ASEAN, where the Chinese interlocutor basically told ASEAN that China is a very big country and ASEAN is a number of little countries, and they should realize that when talking about the South China Sea. Obviously, as the Biden administration begins its round robin of talking with allies and partners, which will start relatively soon, I believe, that will be one of the issues that is going to be talked about. Again, it would be a good idea I think the Biden administration probably believes that it would be a good idea to at least hear out others to see if anybody has really good ideas, but we'll see continued freedom of navigation operations, and we will certainly continue to see part of the rebalancing of military forces in such a way as to continue to use the freedom of navigation that is permitted by international law.
Yeah.
And it's just going to be tough, and we can't let it drop. It's got to be dealt with squarely.
Yeah. Elina, of course, she's the expert on South China Sea issues. So maybe you like to come in at this point and just add on to the question about the South China Sea.
I'll just say that I think another reason why neither of us have touched on South China Sea is there's actually been, to my knowledge, and I might be mistaken, no explicit or specific mention of what to expect from the Biden administration on the South China Sea. Lloyd Austin, in his confirmation hearings, mentioned it in passing, but there was no extended discussion on South China Sea. And so I think we're all waiting to see what the Biden administration will be doing vis-a-vis that area. I think its hands are tied right now with so much going on. And if there is a policy to be articulated, it will be forced upon the administration rather than of it coming of its own volition right now in the face of so many other pressing issues. I just want to very briefly address Professor Sharifah Munira's point about UNSC expansion. The short answer is no, I don't think there's an appetite for that right now. I think if at any time, now is a good time to bring up a more equitable balance in the UNSC because of this awareness that is part of America's self-reflection. But I don't think that anything conclusive will come out of it, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Elina. Now maybe another round of questions. Yes.
Yeah, I think we can do one more round. And this time I am going to, there's still quite a few questions on the international affairs, but I think there are some important questions that bring up sort of domestic developments in the US that would impact this administration, both at home and abroad. So Terence had a question. He wondered if the speakers could provide some insights as to the balance of power in Congress and the Senate and President Biden's ability to move his agenda forward. So it has been shown that the Republicans are generally disciplined along party lines, while Democrats aren't that disciplined, especially in red and purple areas. And how is this going to impact the Biden administration moving forward in its agenda? Building up on that, there was an additional comment on the fact that this is the oldest president to take office, and as unpleasant as it is to say, there might be some concerns on if he may be able to last a full term. So there are probably very serious discussions going on the possibility of Vice President Kamala Harris having to step up. How would we see this take place in terms of priorities, in terms of a continuity in agenda? I will leave it to the panelists.
Since I'm already over 70, I have to say to you that age is just a number.
Here, I go along with that.
And also, if you study the Chinese Communist Party, in the past, most members of the Central Committee and the Politburo, they were all in the 70s. So for China, at least, there was probably an understanding that wisdom comes with age. And if you want to run a country, that's how you should do it. It doesn't mean that we've got to find people over 70 to fill in positions of power. I'm just making a comment in response to that. But that's a very interesting set of questions, and then maybe the member of the panel would like to respond to that.
Well, yeah, you're right, Prof. Zach, that many countries have plenty of old leaders and plenty of them have been successful. The last truly successful president, if you measure it by public opinion, in the U.S. Overall. I don't mean looking at it as a partisan thing. The last one was Ronald Reagan, and he was, of course, very old. He turned 70 shortly after taking office, and people were worried about his health all along. Other countries, of course, had the same problem. Mao and Zhou Enlai, they were both in their mid-70s right to the end. You have to approach every administration with that possibility in mind. 10% of American presidents have been assassinated. So regardless of age, there's always that possibility. And that's why the selection of a vice presidential running mate is always so important. And Biden, of all people, I think, took this into account. Biden appears to be in pretty good health. He certainly appears to be in better health than Trump. So I wouldn't worry overly about that. I think that it's important that things get laid in place, and the fact that you have somebody like Biden, who is very sort of small d democratic in the way he lays out his policies and his preferences, and the way he has selected this cabinet that supports these things. I think that a continuation of Biden's ideas is very likely under Harris, who's not an ideologue really. She's sort of by Democratic Party standards, sort of a middle of the roader. So I wouldn't let that worry me much. The first question, excuse me, that was asked, I'll just touch on for a second and leave it to my fellow panelists. When you have an administration entering office and it has both the Democratic, the same party controlling the House and the Senate, that doesn't always work particularly well. Sometimes it's true that a division there would be helpful, but not always. So we really don't know how well this will work out. I think that what will be a bigger factor in play, and the reason I'm fairly optimistic about Biden's ability to get it done, is people are so rattled. They're so unhappy with what's been going on the last 4 years, and to an extent for the last 15 or 20 years in terms of the polarization of the public, but especially the last 4 years. I think he's going to get goodwill. And what I mean by this is I think that voters, people in the electorate, are going to put pressure on members of Congress to not give him such a hard time. I think that a lot of these things that we've all mentioned today that we're concerned about are going to be helped purely by public opinion, which is as we all know, quite important in the States. So I'm optimistic about it. And I do think that he was given a huge boost on January 5th when the two Democrats from Georgia evened up the Senate, which means, of course, that the Democrats control it because of Harris.
So you want to say something about the U.S. political process and what's it going to be like in terms of the relations between the presidency and the Congress?
I don't know. I think Bill is the expert on these things, but I would tend to agree with him that there will be a honeymoon period because of the way that the president has approached everybody, approached the country, and hopefully that will work towards a way of working together. And again, if they can work out something on healthcare that comes out to be a bilateral, a bipartisan win, I think that would be a super way to build unity, the unity that we're looking for. Yeah, in terms of his age, I think Kamala Harris was picked at least for the fact that she is clearly a presidential candidate on her own, was a presidential candidate on her own, and I would not be surprised to see her be a presidential candidate on her own later on. So I think most of the electorate, after seeing her in action, now I think Biden made a very good choice, and he is in very good shape And I don't think there's going to be much worry about any succession. And the succession is already laid out in the Constitution. And we've been through one of those crises just recently, and I think that we came through it all right. And I think that don't think that there would be another one should it come to a transition of that nature.
Elina, what's your sense of the U.S. political process now that we have the a democratic House of Representatives and the Senate, and with the democratic president? And also, just as one question that just up in my mind is, what are you going to do with this, what do you call it, impeachment of Mr. Trump now that he's left Washington, D.C.? Are they going to be serious about it or what?
Good question.
Yeah, I think that's a political football that will be handled squarely by Congress. I don't think the White House has any incentive right now to be involved in that. So we'll see how that plays out. But I agree that there's going to be a honeymoon period, especially with Democrat control of the executive and the legislature. We'll see how the midterm congressional elections pan out because, and I think this is key for all of us non-Americans to keep in mind, that despite the changes in approach, the US of today is in many ways the US of 2016 and 2008 and before that. I think what we've seen in the last 4 years is really the realist representation so far in modern times of what at least half of America thinks of itself and of the world, but have not had the chance to say it, as explicitly. So in my view, the last 4 years in America were not necessarily an aberration, and I think we'll see this play out politically in the US as well as in foreign policy. When I'm looking for the midterm elections, there may be a swing, but I think foreign policy-wise, we outside of the US will have to be very clear-eyed about what to expect of America.
Maybe we have one last question, Thomas.
Sure, Prof. Zach, thanks. And I'm going to pick half of a question here, and it generally addresses, with all that's happened over the last 4 years and all that's happened over the last 3 weeks. Where is the sense? What is the sense of American exceptionalism in the United States itself, among the minds of its lawmakers, among the lines of its policymakers, among the lines of people who will be advising its policymakers? Perhaps we can sort of wrap up with that. Thank you.
Bill, that's right up your alley.
Well, the term American exceptionalism has become sort of an unfortunate one over time because it's gotten confused with America first. Americans are going to continue to be proud and think that their country does provide a good model for liberty and justice and spreading good democratic values, and that isn't likely to change. But America first as a policy, that's dead, and the world knows it. Americans don't want it. They've rejected it historically, actually, this idea. When it was pushed by people in the 1930s and pushed by people in the 1990s, like Pat Buchanan, this idea has been rejected. Now, it's true Trump got elected through a fluke, but he nevertheless got elected, and that was his battle cry. But he didn't get elected because of that battle cry. He got elected in spite of it. Americans want to turn away from that, in my view, and Biden certainly does. He knows that it's a losing proposition and a wrong one. That's never what America was built on. At least that's my view of the this notion of exceptionalism.
Oh.
Well, I don't know. I think that I think what Elina said at the end of the last question is a very important statement, because that is certainly one of the things that surprised me in looking back at these last 4 years, that there are at least 41% of Americans who deeply believe in the philosophies and in a lot of the racism, the hate speech, the total other, anti-otherness that came out in so many different ways with Trump. And I think that the next 4 years, I hope we learn how to deal with this, because it's not going away. I think that Elina is right. This is something that has always been there, and this is the first time it's been really out in public. So we've got to learn how to deal with this, and we've got to keep it out there. Everybody's got to see it. We've got to recognize it for what it is, and then decide how to deal with it.
Must be in Washington, D.C., Elina. Is that right?
Yeah, and I don't know if it was a little noisy a while back. It was firecrackers, I believe, because people were celebrating Biden, or maybe they were protesting. I'm not quite sure what was going on.
No, huge fireworks display. I've got a TV set on over here.
All
Beautiful fireworks display.
Oh, great. Maybe Elina, you'd like to say one last word, maybe? Elina?
I think the other thing that we should keep an eye out is that, Biden has already promised to convene a summit of democracies in his first year. And I think that, coupled with this self-realization that America has a lot of work to do at home, this will hopefully not be a summit of preaching democracy, but a summit of learning from each other. Now, that said, I think, those of us who are less starry-eyed and enamored with the ideals of democracy as sold to us will perhaps be viewing it a little more critically, if not cynically, especially with the US's past in the region not so long ago, just maybe 50, 60 years ago. And I think that as we move forward, democracy will hopefully not just be a buzzword, whether from the US, in the US, or to and in Southeast Asia. But as I said before, I think those of us in Southeast Asia watching policy unfold within the Biden administration will also have to be very clear-eyed and sober about how US foreign policy will shape our own future in the region.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of the panel, members of the audience, this has been a very useful webinar today. The topic is US foreign policy under President Biden. I think we covered quite a lot of ground in this very short time. There are many issues that we did not touch on, such as the Indo-Pacific, North Korea problem, Russia-US relations, US relations with Western Europe, just to name a few. Perhaps we might organize a different webinar to discuss most of these other issues. I want to thank all the panelists for this contribution that we made today, to the members of the audience who have participated, to ISIS Malaysia, and of course to Health University for co-organizing this webinar. I just want to end with one anecdote, and that is when Mr. Nixon met with Mr. Deng Xiaoping several years ago. Mr. Nixon asked Mr. Deng Xiaoping, "What do you think of the consequences of the French Revolution?" And Mr. Deng Xiaoping's answer was, "It's too early to tell." And so on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I end this webinar. I thank all of you for participating, and we look forward to yet another series of seminars. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.